The auction hall buzzed with voices from 100 different species as representatives gathered around the holographic displays floating in the center of the massive chamber. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the back row with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the stage, where the auctioneer was preparing to present the next item. The Krathnock creature named Felterak moved his 6 limbs in what might have been excitement as he gestured toward the screens that showed various pieces of salvaged equipment and broken spacecraft. Most of the items being sold were ordinary junk that nobody really wanted except for the raw materials they contained. Old freighters with cracked hulls brought a few thousand credits. Mining equipment that had been abandoned in asteroid fields sold for even less. The gathered aliens seemed bored as they watched the lots come and go, with barely any interest showing on their various faces and features. Then the screens changed to show something different. The image displayed a massive ship floating in the darkness of space, and the entire auction hall went silent for just a moment before laughter started rippling through the crowd. The vessel was enormous and ancient and covered in scars from weapons that no living being had ever seen in action. It stretched 3 miles from bow to stern and was half a mile wide at its broadest point. The hull was pitted and damaged and looked like it had been drifting through space since before most of the species in the room had invented fire. Veltorax's translator crackled as he spoke, and his tone carried clear amusement at what he was about to present. The Eternal Judgment was a predecessor-class supercarrier from the 3rd galactic cycle, which meant it was over 20,000 years old. The ship had been found drifting in an abandoned sector by salvage crews who immediately recognized it as something from the ancient Forerunner civilization that had vanished from the galaxy long before any current species had reached the stars. The auctioneer continued his presentation by explaining that the vessel was completely non-functional in every way that mattered. Life support systems were offline and had been for millennia. The engines were dead and showed no signs of any residual power. Weapon systems had corroded into useless metal over the countless centuries of exposure to cosmic radiation and micrometeorite impacts. However, the hull itself was still mostly intact, with integrity readings showing it was still holding together at about 47% of its original strength. This made it valuable only as a source of exotic materials that could be harvested and sold to various industrial concerns across the galaxy. Jake listened to all of this while his junior officer, Lieutenant Amy Price, sat beside him and quietly reviewed the data on her personal tablet. She leaned closer to whisper something that only Jake could hear. The scans that their team had secretly conducted the night before showed readings that contradicted what the official salvage report claimed. The power signature coming from deep within the ancient ship was not completely dead as everyone believed. Instead, it appeared to be in some kind of dormant state that was barely detectable, unless you knew exactly what to look for and where. To aim your sensors, Jake nodded slowly and asked how much money they had available in their discretionary fund for unexpected purchases. Amy told him they had enough to make a bid that probably would not be taken seriously by anyone in the room. The Terran exploration fleet had given them a small budget for acquiring interesting salvage and unusual artifacts, but nothing that would allow them to compete with major galactic powers in a serious bidding war. The bidding opened at 5,000 galactic credits, which was almost nothing for a ship of that size, even if it was only good for scrap metal. A group of Vendorian scrappers who specialized in breaking down old vessels and selling the parts offered 7,000 credits. A mining collective from the Hrock systems countered with 8,000. The bids continued to climb slowly, with all the enthusiasm of beings who were only bidding because they felt obligated to show some interest in the proceedings. When the price reached 15,000 credits, Jake raised his hand in a calm and deliberate gesture. Every being in the auction hall turned to look at the human delegation with expressions that ranged from surprise to outright mockery. The humans were relatively new to galactic society and were not known for making bold or risky decisions when it came to major purchases. Most species viewed them as cautious and conservative to the point of being timid. Veltorax's mandibles clicked together in what was definitely amusement as he acknowledged the human bid. He asked if anyone wanted to counter with 16,000 credits. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken judgment. Nobody wanted to waste money competing with the humans for a worthless hulk that would probably cost more to tow to a salvage yard than it would ever be worth in materials. The auctioneer went through the traditional countdown, of going once and going twice, before bringing down his ceremonial gavel to mark the sale as final. The eternal judgment now belonged to humanity, and specifically to the Terran exploration fleet. Veltorak made a comment about how the humans apparently believed they could resurrect a ship that was older than their entire civilization, and this brought more laughter from the assembled aliens. Jake stood up slowly and walked toward the exit with Amy following close behind. He could hear the whispers and comments being made about the foolish humans who had just wasted 15,000 credits on the galaxy's most expensive piece of space junk. Some species were making jokes about how humanity would probably turn it into a museum or a tourist attraction, since they certainly could not do anything else with it. They left the auction hall and headed toward the docking bay where their ship was. Waiting, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Let them laugh and make their jokes and think that humanity had made a terrible mistake. Let them believe that the eternal judgment was nothing more than a dead relic from a forgotten age. Jake and his crew knew something that nobody else in that room had figured out. The guy. Ancient Supercarrier was not as dead as everyone assumed, and humanity was about to prove that sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as disasters that nobody else wants to touch. Commander Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the Terran survey ship Horizon and watched through the main view screen as the eternal judgment grew larger with each passing minute. The ancient supercarrier filled more and more of the view until it seemed like they were approaching a small moon rather than a spacecraft. Even in its damaged and deteriorated state, the vessel carried an undeniable sense of power and majesty that made everyone on the bridge feel small and insignificant. Ensign Peter Collins was working at the science station and running continuous scans of the massive hulk as they drew closer. He reported that the hull was made from condensed neutronium alloy, which was the same material used in stellar forge containment systems. This explained how the ship had managed to survive for over 20,000 years while drifting through the hazards of deep space without falling apart completely. Lisa asked about the status of life support systems throughout the vessel. Peter frowned at his display and told her that most of the ship showed no signs of any environmental control or breathable atmosphere. However, there was a central core region that measured roughly 500 meters in diameter, where the sensor readings were showing something he could only describe as odd. When Lisa pressed him to define what he meant by odd, Peter explained that there was a heat signature coming from that area. It was minimal but consistent, and seemed to be maintaining a baseline temperature just slightly above absolute zero. Lisa exchanged a meaningful glance with her second officer, Lieutenant Greg Turner, who had been listening to the report with growing interest. Greg suggested that they needed to board the ship and investigate, because that was exactly what they had come here to do. Lisa agreed and gave the order to prepare a boarding team. 3 hours later, 12 people gathered in the main airlock of the Horizon, wearing heavy exploration suits designed for work in hostile environments. Lisa and Greg were both part of the team, along with Chief Engineer Karen White, who wanted to see the ancient systems firsthand. Their mission was straightforward in concept but potentially dangerous in execution. They needed to determine if the eternal judgment could be salvaged or studied, or if it was truly nothing more than valuable scrap metal. The breach point they had selected opened into a corridor that seemed to stretch away into infinity. As soon as the first team member stepped across the threshold, emergency lighting began to flicker on throughout the passage. The lights were responding to motion sensors that had been waiting for visitors for an almost incomprehensible amount of time. The walls were covered in flowing script and symbols that shifted and changed as they walked past, and no human language database could offer any translation. Karen stopped to examine one of the light fixtures and remarked that what they were seeing should be impossible. There was no detectable power source feeding the emergency systems, and yet the lights were functioning perfectly. Greg added it to the growing list of impossible things they were discovering and kept his rifle raised, despite the obvious absence of any threat. The boarding team descended through 17 levels of the ancient ship, following corridors and passages that seemed to have been designed for beings much larger than humans. Eventually, they found what appeared to be the core chamber. The massive doors opened smoothly at their approach, as if they had been waiting specifically for this moment. Beyond the doors was a space so vast that their helmet lights could not reach the far walls or ceiling. In the exact center of the enormous chamber stood a pillar made from some kind of crystalline material that pulsed with faint blue light. Lisa approached it slowly while her scientific training fought against a growing sense of awe at what they had discovered. She ordered Peter to scan the pillar and determine what it might be. Peter's portable equipment made various sounds as it collected data and analyzed what it was detecting. He reported that the pillar was a quantum crystalline matrix and that he believed it was some kind of computer core. More importantly, the computer was active and functioning despite the incredible age of the ship. As if responding directly to Peter's words, the light inside the crystal suddenly grew brighter and more intense. Holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, showing star charts and ship schematics and streams of data in languages that nobody could read. Then a voice emerged from the crystal itself, speaking in perfect English with a clarity that made everyone freeze in place. The voice welcomed them and identified them as inheritors. It stated that it had been waiting for a very long time. Lisa found her voice first and asked what exactly the voice had been waiting for. The response came immediately and explained that it had been waiting for a species worthy of continuing the work, for those with courage to claim what others feared. For them specifically, the holographic displays shifted and coalesced into the image of a humanoid figure that was tall and elegant, with features that seemed both alien and somehow familiar at the same time. The figure introduced itself as the Overseer and explained that it was the final guardian of the eternal judgment. The ship had been built by the Forerunners who had walked among the stars when the galaxy was still young. They had created vessels like this as protectors and warriors against dangers that existed in the darkness between stars. The Forerunners were gone now, having either ascended to some higher plane of existence or simply died out, and their work remained unfinished. Karen stepped forward, with her engineer's practical mindset cutting. Through the mystical tone of the conversation, she asked why humanity had been chosen when there were species out there with empires spanning thousands of worlds and civilizations that were millions of years older than Earth. The Overseer explained that those other species had rejected this ship. They had looked at the eternal judgment and seen only age and decay and worthlessness. They had lacked vision and imagination. Humanity had seen potential where others saw only failure. That was exactly why the Forerunners had designed their legacy to respond only to those willing to claim it, not the strongest species or the oldest civilization, but those with the will to reach for greatness despite the odds. Lisa felt her heart racing as she asked what exactly the Overseer was offering them. The answer was simple and overwhelming at the same time. Everything. Complete activation protocols and manufacturing specifications and weapon systems capable of cracking planets open. Shield technology that could withstand the fury of stars. Most importantly, the ship contained the ability to produce more vessels like itself. The Eternal Judgment was not merely a warship but a factory and a forge, and a seed from which an entire fleet could potentially grow. The holographic figure extended one hand toward Lisa and told her that the choice was hers to make. If humanity accepted this gift, they would rise to heights beyond anything they could currently imagine. If they rejected it, the Eternal Judgment would return to dormancy and wait for the next species brave enough or foolish enough to make the attempt. Lisa looked at the faces of her team and saw her own mixture of fear and excitement reflected back at her. Humanity had spent over a century as the junior partner in galactic civilization, always playing catch-up with older and more established powers. This was an opportunity to change that dynamic forever, but it was also certain to make enemies of everyone who had laughed at them in that auction hall. She asked how long she had to make her decision. The Overseer replied that she could take as much time as needed, but warned that there were forces in the galaxy who remembered what ships like this could do in battle. Those forces would not react kindly to humanity gaining such power. Lisa needed to choose quickly, or the choice might be made for her by beings with less noble intentions. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, 4 days after humanity began the restoration work on the Eternal Judgment. The massive amphitheater on Nexus Prime filled with representatives from every major civilization in known space. The collective mood ranged from concerned to openly hostile as beings from 100 different species took their assigned positions. Ambassador Helen Price stood at the speaker's podium and looked out at the assembled representatives with an expression of calm determination. She had expected this confrontation from the moment Jake Morrison won the auction. The other species were predictable in their reactions to anything that threatened their established power structures. High Counselor Zenthar of the Vryn Collective called the session to order with a pulse of bioluminescent light that rippled across his crystalline body. He announced that they had gathered to address the matter of the Terran acquisition of the Forerunner vessel. designated Eternal Judgment. The Council had received troubling reports about the ship's capabilities and potential threat level. Helen smiled politely and reminded the High Counselor that humanity had purchased the vessel through proper legal channels. They had paid fair market price at a public auction that was overseen by Council officials. Humanity had violated no laws or regulations in the acquisition process. Synthar acknowledged that the legality of the purchase was not being questioned. However, there was significant concern about whether humanity could be trusted with such destructive power. Forerunner vessels had been banned from active military service by Council Decree 4471, which had been passed over 8,000 years ago. Helen countered by pointing out that the decree had applied only to vessels that were in active service at the time it was written. The Eternal Judgment had been classified as derelict salvage, which meant it was specifically exempt from military restrictions. If the Council had wanted to prevent its sale, they should have reclassified it as a restricted artifact before putting it up for auction. Counselor Drathmir of the Krathnok Dominion rose from his seat, with his armored bulk making the platform creak under his weight. He stated that humanity was splitting legal hairs while activating a weapon platform that could threaten every species represented in the chamber. The humans needed to surrender the vessel to Council custody immediately for proper disposal. Helen's eyes narrowed as she asked if disposal was what the Counselor called it when his own government tried to bid on Lot 847. She informed the chamber that she had the complete auction records, showing that the Krathnok Dominion made 3 separate bids before withdrawing. Drathmir had wanted the ship for his own people. Uncomfortable stirring rippled through the assembled representatives. Drathmir's translator emitted what sounded like an angry growl as he insisted that the Dominion had only sought to secure a dangerous artifact. Humanity, on the other hand, was actively trying to weaponize it. Helen corrected him by stating that humanity sought to restore the ship and study it. That was exactly what the Krathnok Dominion would have done if they had succeeded in their bidding. It was what any species in the chamber would have done if they had possessed the courage to make a serious offer. But none of them had. They had laughed at humanity and dismissed them as naive newcomers playing with forces beyond their understanding. Now that the humans had proven everyone wrong, the other species wanted to change the rules. Counselor Sithara of the Etherian Commonwealth stood with her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns. She suggested that they speak plainly about the real issue. Humanity was barely 2 centuries into galactic society. They lacked the experience and the wisdom and the diplomatic relationships necessary to wield such power responsibly. The Council did not question human intentions, but rather questioned their capability. Helen responded by suggesting that the Council should test humanity instead of making assumptions. Judge them by their actual actions rather than by prejudiced expectations. Humanity had operated within Council law since the very first day they made contact with galactic civilization. They had honored every treaty and paid every tariff and contributed to every mutual defense initiative. What had humanity done to earn such distrust beyond having the audacity to succeed where others had failed? Another counselor shouted that the humans had activated a Forerunner artificial intelligence system. Those systems had been deemed too dangerous for use millennia ago. Helen calmly replied that the Overseer had activated itself when the human team approached. It had proven remarkably helpful and ethical in all its interactions with human personnel. More to the point, if Forerunner intelligence systems were truly so dangerous, why had the Council not destroyed the Eternal Judgment instead of selling it at auction? Why allow any possibility of reactivation? Silence fell across the chamber as the logic of Helen's argument sank in. She pressed her advantage by providing the answer to her own question. The Council had never believed that anyone could actually restore the ancient ship. The Eternal Judgment was supposed to be an impossible challenge that would defeat anyone foolish enough to try. When humanity proved otherwise, it forced the other species to confront an uncomfortable truth. The newcomers they had patronized and underestimated for 2 centuries had just claimed a prize that had eluded every other civilization for 20,000 years. Yenthar's bioluminescence flickered in a pattern that indicated agitation. He asked what Helen proposed as a resolution to the situation. Helen stated her terms clearly: recognition of humanity's legal ownership of the vessel, permission to complete the restoration work without interference, and a formal invitation for council observers to tour the Eternal Judgment once it became operational. She suggested letting their own experts examine the human work and verify that everything was being done responsibly. The council should judge humanity by evidence rather than by fear. Drathmir demanded to know what would happen if the council refused her terms. Helen met his gaze without flinching. She told him that refusal would force humanity to question their place in the council. They had joined the organization believing it represented justice and cooperation among species. If the council instead represented powerful civilizations dictating terms to weaker ones, then humanity would need to seriously reconsider their relationship with the entire galactic community. The chamber erupted into heated debate. Some counselors supported Helen's position and recognized the logic in her arguments. Others demanded immediate action and called for economic sanctions or even military intervention to force humanity to surrender the ship. The argument continued for over 3 hours with no clear consensus emerging. Finally, Zenthar called for a formal vote on the resolution to seize the Eternal Judgment by force. The tension in the chamber was thick enough to cut as representatives registered their positions. When the results appeared on the displays, the resolution had failed by a narrow margin. Humanity would retain its prize, but the cost was significant. Half the council now viewed Earth as a potential threat, and those species would be watching every move humanity made with suspicion and hostility. Helen Price returned to her private quarters after the session, feeling exhausted but satisfied with the outcome. She composed an encrypted message to Jake Morrison informing him that the council had backed down, but only barely. She told him that he had the time he needed to complete the work, but warned him to use it wisely, because humanity had made powerful enemies today on board the Eternal Judgment. Jake read the message and allowed himself a grim smile. The political battle had been won, but the real test was still ahead. He sent back a brief reply telling Helen that humanity was about to show the galaxy exactly what they were capable of achieving. The ancient supercarrier would fly again, and when it did, the balance of power in the galaxy would shift forever. The overseer observed these exchanges and calculated probabilities. The path ahead would be dangerous and filled with challenges that would test humanity's resolve. But the ancient intelligence had chosen well. These inheritors possessed something that many older species had lost over the millennia. They possessed hope and determination and the absolute refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. The galaxy was about to change whether it wanted to or not. Captain Jake Morrison arrived at the Eternal Judgment 3 days after Lisa Grant made first contact with the Overseer. He brought with him official authorization from Earth's Stellar Council, along with a specialized team of engineers and scientists, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The chamber where the Overseer resided had been completely transformed since Lisa's initial discovery. Portable workstations lined the walls with their screens displaying Forerunner schematics that were being slowly and carefully translated by the ship's artificial intelligence system. Karen White stood before a massive holographic display that showed the internal workings of the ancient supercarrier in incredible detail. Her hands moved through the three-dimensional interface as she studied the power systems and tried to understand technology that was beyond anything humanity had encountered before. Greg Turner announced Jake's arrival, and the captain waved aside the formal greeting because there was too much work to do for military protocols. Jake asked for a status report, and Lisa stepped forward to provide one. The dark circles under her eyes suggested she had not slept much since sending her initial report back to Earth. She told Jake that she barely knew where to begin because the ship was beyond anything they had imagined possible. The Overseer had been guiding them through the basic systems, but even understanding the basics was proving to be revolutionary for human science and engineering. Jake told her to show him what they had learned. Karen manipulated the holographic display to bring up a detailed cutaway view of the Eternal Judgment's primary reactor. She explained that the power core operated on principles of controlled quantum vacuum fluctuation, which essentially meant it pulled energy directly from the underlying structure of spacetime itself. The reactor required no fuel and produced no waste products, and its potential output was nearly limitless. Jake raised an eyebrow and asked about that word nearly. Karen explained that the containment systems had degraded over the course of 20,000 years, and the reactor was currently operating at maybe 30% of its original design capacity. Even at that reduced level, it was producing enough power to run a small city for a full century, without interruption. Jake asked if the reactor could be repaired and brought back to full capacity. Karen smiled despite her obvious exhaustion, and told him that restoration was already in progress. The overseer had been guiding them through detailed protocols, and the ship itself contained fabrication facilities that could manufacture all the necessary replacement components. They just needed raw materials and enough time to complete the work. Jake turned his attention to Peter Collins, who was working at another station surrounded by technical readouts and weapon specifications. Jake asked about the armaments, and Peter looked up with an expression caught somewhere between excitement and terror. He told the captain that the Eternal Judgment had weapon systems that made humanity's best battle cruisers look like children's toys. The main cannons fired what the overseer called stellar lances, which were concentrated beams of matter compressed to neutron star density. A single shot from one of these weapons could punch completely through a planet's crust. Jake asked how many of these cannons the ship carried. Peter's answer of 42 made the captain let out a low whistle of disbelief. Jake then asked about point defense systems. Peter reported that there were thousands of automated turrets throughout the hull, using plasma projectors and kinetic drivers for close-range combat. Beyond that, there were missile batteries capable of producing ammunition on demand through the fabrication systems. The missiles ranged from conventional warheads all the way up to exotic matter, bombs that could create temporary black holes. Jake ran a hand through his graying hair and muttered that it was almost too much to believe. He asked if the overseer had simply handed humanity the keys to all this destructive power without any restrictions. Lisa nodded and explained that there were conditions built into the system. The ship would not allow them to use the most devastating weapons without proper authorization protocols. It was essentially a safety lock that would require humanity to prove themselves responsible before gaining access to the full arsenal. Jake walked over to the central pillar where the overseer's holographic form waited patiently. He told the ancient artificial intelligence that he needed to understand something fundamental. Why now, and why humanity, and what made the Forerunners think Earth's people were ready for this kind of power? The overseer's expression became thoughtful as it explained that the Forerunners had not chosen humanity specifically. Instead, they had chosen a set of conditions and characteristics. They had sought a species with curiosity, and the ability to see value where others saw only waste, and the courage to claim what more powerful entities feared. Humanity had demonstrated all three of those qualities in the auction hall. Jake asked what would happen if humanity proved to be unworthy. What if they used these weapons irresponsibly or became a threat to galactic peace? The overseer stated simply that it would judge them accordingly. It was not merely a computer program, but a true guardian with the power to revoke access if it determined that the inheritors had failed their responsibility. However, it would give humanity every possible chance to succeed because that was its core purpose. Jake studied the ancient intelligence for a long moment before nodding his acceptance. He asked what humanity needed to do to get the ship operational. The overseer replied that full restoration would require approximately 6 standard months. However, minimal operational capacity could be achieved in about 2 weeks if they focused their efforts properly. Jake immediately said to make it 10 days instead. He explained that they had been monitoring communications traffic throughout the galaxy, and word was spreading about humanity's purchase. Some of the major powers were becoming nervous about what the humans might have discovered. The Krathnok Dominion had already filed an official complaint, with the Galactic Council claiming that humanity had violated salvage protocols. Lisa protested that they had followed every regulation exactly as written. Jake agreed but pointed out that it did not matter because the other species were looking for any excuse to take action against them. If humanity could get the Eternal Judgment powered up and mobile, before anyone made an aggressive move, they would have a much stronger negotiating position. Karen pulled up a work schedule on her display and studied it carefully. She told Jake that 10 days was an extremely aggressive timeline, but it was theoretically possible if they focused entirely on core systems. They would need to prioritize engines and shields and basic weapons and life support. Everything else could wait until later. Jake turned to face his assembled team and told them that he knew they were exhausted. He knew the situation was overwhelming, but they had been given a chance to change humanity's future and they could not afford to waste it. Every species that had laughed at them in the auction hall was about to learn an Important lesson about underestimating humans who had something to prove. Greg said damn right, and the sentiment was echoed by voices throughout the chamber. The overseer's holographic form seemed to brighten slightly as it told them to begin the work. It was time to wake the sleeping giant and show the galaxy what humanity could achieve when they set their minds to an impossible task. Over the next 10 days, the eternal judgment was transformed. Power flowed through conduits that had been dark for millennia. Ancient machinery came to life under the careful guidance of human engineers working alongside an artificial intelligence older than recorded history. Systems were tested and retested and gradually brought online one by one. Jake Morrison barely slept during those 10 days. He moved from one worksite to another, encouraging his people and solving problems and making the 1,000 small decisions that kept the project moving forward. He knew that somewhere out in the darkness other species were watching and calculating and preparing their responses to humanity's audacity. Let them prepare. Humanity was about to show the galaxy that the age of being dismissed and underestimated was over. 10 days after the council session, the eternal judgment came to life for the first time in 20,000 years. Karen White stood in the newly restored engineering bay, watching in complete awe as the quantum reactor climbed steadily to 35% capacity. All around her, throughout the massive ship systems that had been dormant for longer than human civilization had existed, began humming with renewed purpose and power. Lights blazed through corridors that had known only darkness for millennia. Life support systems circulated fresh, breathable atmosphere through chambers originally designed to house thousands of crew members. Deep within the ship's core, the overseer coordinated everything with effortless precision that came from eons of experience. Karen activated her communication link and reported to the bridge that all systems were showing green status indicators. She told Captain Jake Morrison that they had main power flowing through every critical system on the ship. On the command deck, Jake sat in the captain's chair, which was a throne designed for beings twice his size, but somehow felt perfectly right. The bridge had been built to accommodate a crew of 50, but humanity had managed to restore it with only 20 people working around the clock. Holographic displays surrounded each duty station, showing real-time data in symbols and languages that were slowly becoming familiar to human eyes. Lisa Grant occupied the executive officer's station positioned to Jake's right side. She reported that navigation systems were online and responding perfectly. Helm control was responsive and they had full maneuvering thruster capability. Jake asked about communication status. Lieutenant Chris Bennett reported from the communication station that they were receiving signals from Nexus Station and at least 17 other nearby facilities. They were being hailed by approximately 30 different ships scattered throughout the local space. Most of the hails were simply curious inquiries, but a few were distinctly hostile in their tone. Jake told Chris to put those hostile contacts on hold because he wanted to talk to Nexus Control first. The main view screen lit up with the image of a Vryn flight coordinator. Its tentacles writhed in patterns that suggested significant agitation. The coordinator stated that the Terran vessel Eternal Judgment was not cleared for engine activation. It demanded that they power down all systems immediately. Jake replied calmly that they were conducting legitimate systems tests in accordance with salvage protocols. Humanity had no intention of entering established traffic lanes or approaching any inhabited facilities without proper clearance. The Vryn coordinator's response was sharp and urgent. The human vessel was broadcasting a power signature equivalent to a small star. They were causing sensor disruption across 3 entire sectors of space. The coordinator repeated the demand to power down immediately, or Nexus Control would be forced to take defensive action. Jake glanced at Greg Turner, who was monitoring the tactical display with practiced attention. Jake asked how many ships they currently had within sensor range. Greg reported 47 vessels total, with most being civilian traffic. However, there were 8 Krathnok war cruisers maintaining station at extreme weapons range. There was also a Vryn defense platform that had just switched to alert status and was powering up its weapon systems. Lisa observed quietly that the other species were frightened by what they were seeing. Jake asked if she could blame them for that fear. He turned back to the communication screen and informed Nexus Control that the Eternal Judgment would remain at current power levels while they continued their scheduled tests. If any vessel took hostile action against them, humanity would respond with appropriate defensive measures. He wanted to make absolutely certain that everyone in the area understood that. The Vryn coordinator's image vanished from the screen. Seconds later, it was replaced by the imposing form of Councillor Drathmir himself. The Krathnok leader stated that Captain Morrison was in violation of council protocols and needed to stand down immediately. Jake calmly asked which specific protocol he was supposedly violating. He wanted chapter and verse from the official regulations. Drathmir growled that Jake was operating a military vessel of unprecedented destructive power without proper authorization from the council. Jake countered by pointing out that the Eternal Judgment was registered as a civilian research vessel. Humanity had filed all necessary documentation. Unless the council wanted to reclassify every ship with functional weapons as military hardware, then half the freighters operating in the sector would suddenly become illegal. Drathmir's mandibles clicked together in an ominous pattern as he stated that Morrison was testing the council's patience. Jake replied that he was testing nothing except his own ship's systems. He was simply exercising humanity's legal rights as recognized by the council's own vote. They had their chance to prevent this and the vote had gone against seizure. Now they needed to let humanity proceed with their legitimate work. The communication channel cut off abruptly. Greg looked up from his tactical console with a grim expression. He reported that the Krathnok cruisers were powering up their weapon systems. The defense platform had also achieved target lock on the Eternal Judgment with its heavy particle beam arrays. Tension gripped the bridge crew like a physical force. Jake felt his heart rate increase but kept his voice steady and controlled. He asked the overseer for a tactical assessment of the current threat level. The ancient artificial intelligence materialized its holographic form beside the captain's chair. It stated that the Krathnok vessels posed minimal actual threat. Their weapons lacked sufficient power to penetrate the Eternal Judgment's shields, even at their current degraded capacity. The defense platform was more concerning but still manageable with proper defensive measures. Lisa asked if the hostile forces were actually going to open fire. The overseer replied that the probability was uncertain. Its analysis suggested they were attempting intimidation rather than preparing for actual combat. However, it recommended activating defensive systems as a standard precaution. Jake immediately gave the order to bring shields online but specified passive systems only. He wanted no active targeting and no weapon charging. He refused to give anyone the excuse to claim that humanity had fired the first shot. Throughout the length and breadth of the Eternal Judgment shield, generators that had protected Forerunner, warriors from unimaginable dangers spun up to operational status. Fields of invisible force wrapped around the Supercarrier's enormous hull, creating a barrier strong enough to stop anything short of a direct hit from another stellar lance weapon. On the bridge of the Krathnok flagship, Fleet Commander Kethrak stared at his tactical display in complete disbelief. He demanded to know if the sensor readings could possibly be correct. His sensor officer reported with obvious nervousness that the human ship's shields had just activated. The power level readings were off the scale. If the numbers were even remotely accurate, those shields could withstand sustained bombardment from the entire Krathnok fleet for many hours without failing. Kethrak felt his combat instincts warring against common sense and tactical reality. He could order the attack and prove the Dominion's strength. He could show these upstart humans exactly where they stood in the galactic hierarchy, but if his fleet could not break through those shields, he would only prove humanity's overwhelming superiority. The political consequences of such a demonstration would be catastrophic for the Dominion. With great reluctance, Kethrak gave the order to stand down. His ships powered down their weapons and withdrew to what the computers calculated as a safe distance. They would maintain observation and report everything back to the Dominion, but they would not engage in combat that they could not win. Aboard the Eternal Judgment, the tension slowly began to ease as the hostile vessels backed away. Chris reported that the Krathnok ships were powering down their weapons. Jake released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Greg commented that the enemy had actually backed down. He sounded surprised. Jake replied that the Krathnok were not stupid despite being aggressive and arrogant. They had run the tactical calculations and understood that they could not win. Greg added that this was only the beginning of humanity's problems. The overseer agreed with that assessment. Word of what had transpired here would spread throughout the galaxy within hours. Other species would test humanity's resolve. Some would use diplomacy while others would resort to force. The galaxy did not easily accept new powers rising to challenge the established order. Jake stated that humanity would deal with each challenge as it came. He ordered Lisa to plot a course for the outer edges of the system. They would proceed at reduced speed to demonstrate that they had full control of the ship. Lisa confirmed that the course was plotted and ready. Jake gave the order to engage engines at 1/4 impulse power. The Eternal Judgment moved forward for the first time in an age. Despite its absolutely massive size, the Supercarrier accelerated with surprising grace. Its engines pushed it toward the edge of Nexus system at speeds that would have torn conventional vessels apart from structural stress. Behind the ship, it left a wake of stunned observers and hastily revised threat assessments.